Hello and welcome to the Extraordinary Retirement Podcast with your hosts, Gregg Indovina and Nate Yeomans. I'm Wendy McConnell. Well, hello there, fellas. How you doing?
Doing great, Wendy. How are you?
Doing fantastic.
It's a good day when I get to see both of your faces.
Absolutely.
Yes, and there's an extra face in here today.
I see that.
Yeah, we're super excited about our podcast today. We have Brendan Frazier joining us. Brendan has been a huge addition to the RFG Advisory team as the Chief Behavioral Officer. So we're going to dive into a little bit of what that is. But Brendan's got a really deep background in helping people with the psychological challenges and shifts into retirement and living the most fulfilling life. And so we're going to spend some time today talking about how do we live a successful retirement and make sure that it's a purpose-driven one as well. So, Brendan, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited and pumped to be here, and just want to throw out the quick disclaimer because there will always be people wondering, I know this by now, that no, I am not the actor, nor do I have any relation to the actor named Brendan Frazier. So let's just get that one thing clear for those that can't get that out of their head at the moment. And no, I don't know what he's up to in his life at this point, because that's by far and away the number one question I get. It's like, what's he doing now? I'm like, well, I actually don't know because I'm not him. So you might think that I would, but I don't. But anyways, just we want to clear the air on that.
Thanks for clearing that up. Yeah. So for the audience that is listening and not watching you at the same time, they'll realize it's not the same person. So
that's exactly right.
Well, Brendan, why don't you kick us off a little bit? Tell us a little bit about who you are, since we know you're not the Brendan Frazier. But who are you? And tell us a little bit about your role as the Chief Behavior Officer with RFG Advisory.
Yeah, who I am is, I think, not the most interesting question. But when I think about who I am at this point in my life, I am a dad and a husband, and it feels like that takes up about 80% of my life, and there's not a whole lot of margin for the rest. The other part of who I am, I suppose, is the Chief Behavioral Officer. And so I think the way I like to think of it is this: it's just most people are like, Chief Behavioral Officer. I mean, even my friends, when I got this job, we're out there working out. They're like, what is that? Like, what does that even mean? It's like, that's a good question. Nobody actually really knows. So the way I kind of describe it is like this: is we all know that money requires a numerical component. We all know that you can look at money and you see numbers and spreadsheets and decimal points and dollar signs, and all of that is completely normal. It's what we get taught. It's what we learn. It's what we read and think about. There's this whole other dynamic that comes into money and finances that we don't really get to hear much about. We don't really learn much about, but it plays just as much of a role in impacting our finances. And that's the psychological side, the emotional side, the behavioral side, what I call, to try to wrap it up into one, call the human side. And so that part is there. And so I have a friend in the industry who talks about and writes about this stuff a lot, who describes it and says, we sort of see that aspect of money at like gravity, where it's there and you don't really see it and nobody really talks about it, but it's impacting you, and it impacts everything that you do, whether you know it or not, whether you feel it or not. And so you can either choose to do two things. You can either choose to ignore it and try to live life without it, but that's probably not a good idea. If you jumped off of a building thinking that there was no gravity, it probably wouldn't end well. Same thing goes with this human side with money. It's there. It impacts us. It's present whether we realize it or not. And so our choices are to either embrace it, recognize it, and figure out how to manage it, or to turn our back and walk away from it. And nobody wants to do that. That's when you end up going, I know the things that I'm supposed to do, but for some reason I just can't seem to do it. I can't seem to stick with it. I can't seem to get to where I want to go financially. And sometimes that's because of money. But what research tells us and stories tell us is that oftentimes it's not the money that's the barrier there. It's what's going on in our minds. Because of that, you're seeing this shift and this movement in the money management, financial services industry, where we're deciding to put more of an emphasis on helping the clients recognize that, be aware of it, understand it, and at the same time equipping advisors with a skill set and the awareness that they need to work with clients around it. And so that's how this whole thing came about. Was the RFG said, hey, we see this movement in the industry heading this way. We want to be on the forefront. And so the rest is history.
And Brendan, we kind of have, Nate and I have a little bit of the opposite problem where when people ask what we do and we say we do financial planning, we focus on retirement planning, they assume that they know exactly what that means. And their assumption is that it is 100% financial, getting somebody financially prepared for the stage of life where your money has to fund your lifestyle. And although that is certainly a foundational thing, a foundational piece that Nate and I work on, what we have found is that that alone does not mean that someone's going to have a good life. And that's why the name of our podcast is Extraordinary Retirement. So from your standpoint, what are the keys? Assuming we have the financial foundation laid well, where we have enough income and we've accounted for all the potential things that could go wrong, et cetera, and insurances, et cetera, all that stuff is in place. What then is required for a fulfilling retirement in your view?
Yeah, this could be you could write a book on this. You could do a several episode podcast series on this, because there's a lot of elements that go into that, like the overarching question. But if we want to try to boil it down to what are some of the key things to know that you can do, the key things to be aware of, and the things that you could do, the first thing I would say is this, which is you hit on something that you didn't really breeze over it, but you said like the numbers line up. We have the income that we need. We've got the savings that we need. We have our insurance in place. Like that in and of itself is also no small feat. That deserves to be praised as well, because I kind of believe that you can't really flourish or pursue meaning and purpose until you have we'll call it like your basic needs. Maybe we can think of it that way. Like your basic needs set, or you have them you at least feel like, hey, I'm going to be okay. Because until you get to that point, it's really hard to move and think bigger or go bigger picture, it's really hard to think, hey, how can I flourish when I'm just trying to survive? And so even getting things mapped out, like, hey, here's my cash flow, here's the income I need, here's how I know that my odds of ever running out of this money are very, very low, or we have things we can do to prevent it from happening. And I've got protection in place in case something ever happens to me. Once you do all that, then you can kind of start thinking, okay, what's next? What's possible now? How do I go from knowing my basic needs are met to moving towards meaning or purpose and fulfillment? And so the easiest construct that I've found that encapsulates this comes from a retirement researcher named Michael Finke. And so he calls it the 3 pillars of a happy and successful retirement. Number 1 is money. Right? And so in other words, you have to, like we just said, make sure you've got the money side down, because it's not just about and only about that, but still pretty important. The money aspect is still a critical component of it. And so that's number 1. So we don't really need to spend a whole lot of time focused in diving into that. Number 2 is health. And when he says health, what he means is like it's not only just taking care of yourself, but also like investing in your health and being aware of your health. Because what we find, or actually what intuitively, is that nobody's getting any younger. Very rarely do you feel better 10 years from now than you do today. Now, and then there's things you can do to sort of like increase your longevity, things you can do to stay healthy, to improve your vitality, to be energetic. But by and large, there's this health component that if you don't start addressing and thinking about now, we only get worse and worse, right? It only goes downhill. We're not getting healthier as we age. And so there's never a better time to start investing in and focusing on your health than today. Like no one's ever said, you know what, I'm really glad I waited that extra 5 years before I finally kicked it in gear and got in shape. So that's another key component of is how are you investing in your health? What are you doing to make sure that your health is on track? Because I think the example he uses in the interview that we did was it's sort of like an elevator, where your health doesn't ever stay stagnant. You're either moving backwards or getting worse, or you can sort of start working against it. And so he said, if you think about being on an elevator, if you're not working to make your health better, if you're not working to move up while the elevator's going down, then you're just going to be going down with it. And every day that you wait to do something, you're going down further and further, and it's harder to climb back up. The third pillar
Well, the old adage there is it's a lot easier to stay in shape than to get in shape.
Yeah.
Right. So continually doing things to make small steps forward, I think, is the idea there. Is how do we, just have continual progress in the right direction? It's a lot easier to do that than to try to start from the ground zero sometimes. So
And getting healthy isn't just about living longer, expanding your life. It's having a better health span, the years that you are alive, that you're able to do more.
yeah.
And so that's important as well. But go ahead. So the third pillar being...
No, that's exactly right. I was going to say Nate, you said it's an old adage. And I always laugh because like the old adages, you've heard them before, but they stick around for a reason. It's because generally speaking, they're true. Otherwise, they would have been long gone. We wouldn't be still saying them years later because it's so true. And then also, Greg, I love the term health span because we think about lifespan. We're familiar with the term lifespan, and we can kind of visualize it even linearly, thinking like, here's where I am today. And you go on this linear path and say, maybe if I live to be 90, here's where I would be. This is my lifespan. But we don't think about how our health span plays into that. And then where are your healthiest years? And what does that look like as you get older? So I think that term health span is, I love that. I think it's a great one. The, third pillar is social connection or social relationships, which I don't think anybody thinks like, oh, social connection, social relationships are overrated. And we all kind of know like, yes, those things are important. There's study after study after study that shows how those people who are actively involved in not social networks, but with social connections, solid social relationships are actually both mentally and physically healthier than those that aren't. And so his whole point was he was harping on the fact that when you go into, if we think about retirement, since that's kind of what this question centered around, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes what you can find, and you guys tell me if you've seen differently, but you'll find people who a lot of their social connection and social relationships comes from the work that they do, whether you work at a company or you work for yourself, like you're connecting with people through the work that you do day in and day out. So let's say one day you decide to retire. The next day you don't have that anymore. And all of a sudden you don't realize it, but you start getting sick more often. You start not feeling as motivated. You don't have the same amount of energy. And a lot of times it's because we don't have the same social connection built in that we always had. Now I'll throw a little call out section in here because he did it. And I thought it was a great point because I think about this a lot. He basically said he said in no lesser terms that men are the worst at this. That when they look at the data, I think anecdotally we would agree, but when we look at the data, men have a lot of room to improve. Let's put it that way. When it comes to maintaining social relationships and connections throughout their lives, women tend to be much better at it. I think men tend to default to like we have our relationships at work, and I've got a couple friends from the past, but we're not great at proactively investing in social relationships. And to the point where in one of the studies they did, they found that the happiest group of people, when they were assessing happiness, when they found that the happiest group of people based on the scale that they implemented were women aged 55 to 59 who were recently divorced. And it was like, wait a minute, hang on. What? First of all, I'm never letting my wife ever listen to that episode. I mean, we've got a little bit of time, but I'm not going to let her. I'm never going to tell her about that one or let her find the study. But his whole point was, by that point, men are relying very heavily on their spouse as their primary source of social connection. And that I'm not going to say they drag them down, right? But like it becomes a little bit of a burden and a weight. And so when the spouse, the female, when the wife, when she's finally divorced, she feels like she's free to go do these social things. She's not being held back anymore. That's what they kind of piece together as probably the most likely reason. But it's mostly just we'll call it a challenge to all the men out there, myself included, to say, find ways that you can invest in social relationships and connections. And I'll just finish it by saying this, because he gives a great example of how to do it. And because when I think about that, I'm like, okay, so like, who am I going to hang out with? What am I going to do? Like, I don't want to just go like get coffee every day. Like, I like to be active. And so he gave a great example of a guy he's a member of a car club. But he loves cars, buys cars, has a huge collection. And some people might look at that and say, that's not a good use of of money, right? Like you look at it and you go, that's just spending money that you don't need on unnecessary material things. That could certainly be one viewpoint, one way that it gets looked at. The point that Michael was making from their research and from this one example was that I was actually his social connection. So it wasn't even about the cars. It was because he loves them, but it came with a built-in social network where he was getting to know people with a similar passion. They were getting together on a weekly basis. And so that came naturally built in. So it can even be thinking about how do you build these relationships around the things that you love to do, the activities that you enjoy doing. How can you find a way to incorporate that? If you're like me and you're like, I don't want to just sit down over coffee and talk about life every day, right? Not that there's anything wrong with that. I wish I was better at it, but that felt daunting. And he gave that example and I was kind of like, okay, yeah, I mean, I could probably go out and play tennis with a few guys once a week, or pickleball or golf or whatever it might be.
Yeah, so it's more about the people than the actual event or the thing that you're doing. It's the community. It's the people that you're doing it with. And it's interesting because I literally had this conversation yesterday, Brendan. A very similar situation. So to where husband has been working and winding down the business. She's been a part of that business and has helped wind it down as well. But her role has started to diminish a little bit more than his. We found ourselves in the middle of this conversation to where she said, years ago, while he was traveling a lot for the company, I had to start finding my own social network and starting to find purpose in things that I would do that now revolves a lot around the kids and the grandkids and other activities. And she's ahead of the game. And they recognized that in the conversation yesterday to where he's saying, I've now got to go figure out how to do that. That's something I've never had to do, and it's a concern. So it really opened up, I think, a really interesting conversation, and that exact dynamic that you just shared, that we've got one spouse who has developed more of a social network, more of a community, and another one that is coming into that phase. And that's a big transition, and they're recognizing that emotional component to that. And so I think with all of that said, from an emotional or psychological perspective, I'd like to shift the conversation to talking about the importance of intentionality in retirement. What is your feelings about being intentional in retirement and how that helps somebody emotionally?
Well, I think the way I look at it is it's the same way to think about intention and intentionality in all aspects of life. So there's one research study that was done where they went and looked at they tried to gather a profile of retirees and interviewed thousands of retirees. And there's two stats that always stick out to me from that. I mean, stick out because you kind of sit there and you go, whoa. One is the number one activity of retirees. Once they retire, the number one activity that they do day in and day out is watch TV. It's like 83% of retirees spend at least some time watching TV every day. The other one, that one's more striking. The one that's a little bit more convicting or saddening, or I'm not going to say depressing, that's probably a little too strong, is that 24% of retirees say that the life that they're living now is living up to the expectation that they had before they retired. So like 3 out of 4 people are saying, hey, this isn't exactly what I was expecting or envisioning whenever I decided to retire. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a number of factors that go into that, but I think intention and purpose is the one antidote to try to avoid living an experience that's not up to what you expected. So there's a quote in a book by Mark Manson, his best-selling book. He's the author. There's a quote where he says there's 2 possible outcomes in this life. Either you choose to use it intentionally, or it will be chosen for you. And I think that's good, but I also spin that a little bit, completely rip off the quote or borrow it, let's say. And I think of it like this. There's 2 possible outcomes with money or with retirement. Either you choose to use it intentionally or it will be chosen for you. What that means is every day every decision that you make, every way that you decide to allocate your time, effort, and energy during the day, it's determined by something. It's dictated by something. Whether you choose intentionally what to do or not, it'll either be chosen for you or you choose what to do. And the same thing goes with money. If left to our own devices, here's the best way to think of this. We tend to go through life on autopilot. Try not to make too many decisions because it could be taxing on the brain to be in this conscious, deliberate thinking mode for too long. So we go through on autopilot, which is a great thing for survival. It's part of the reason why we're still here. Our brain works that way so we could survive. The problem is that autopilot isn't always the best way to make deliberate, intentional decisions. And so oftentimes what that looks like is you wake up one morning, you think about like the past 2 days that went by, and you're like, what did I do for the last couple of days? It's like, well, I sat around, I binge watched a couple shows on Netflix, probably checked a few things off my to-do list that I needed to get done that felt a little bit better. Maybe did some work in the yard, but you have to ask and assess and take an inventory and go, did any of those things meaningfully contribute to the things that are important to me in my life? So am I doing things intentionally, or is it being chosen for me in a reactive way? Right. And so instead it would be like, okay, if I know that it's important to focus on my health, if it's important to invest in social connections, if I know that I want to intentionally create experiences that with my friends and my family, what that would mean is instead of going into the day and just reacting to everything that comes your way, you'd be intentional about saying, hey, if I've got some free time, I want to use it to blank in a meaningful, purposeful, intentional way, instead of letting it going through an autopilot and letting it just fill up with things that come along throughout the day that will take it up for you. That space is going to get filled either intentionally or by the things of the busyness of life.
I have a follow-up question about intentionality. What areas are important for a retiree to focus on when they sit down to be intentional about their life in this second half? You mentioned health. I would imagine things like learning, relationships. What are some of the categories that people need to focus on to be intentional about?
Yeah, I think there's generic categories that you can kind of look at a high level view. And then there's some that are going to mean more to some people than others. Right. And so like when you think generically, you go, well, health, social connections, like we talked about, family is another one. Like, yes, that's a little bit social, but also it's a little bit more than just social connections. Another thing would be giving back, whether that's your time or your money. How are you giving back? Leisure time. What are the things you like to do for fun? You just mentioned, oh shoot, what did you just said?
Learning, I think.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Learning. Right. So if you're somebody that enjoys learning, you can focus on that. One of the things the question is, how do I identify these things? Right. I want to be intentional, but I need to know what to be intentional about. And there's no one perfect way to go about doing that. But there's some questions that you can ask. There's some things you can do to try to pull up and extract, like, what are those things, right? So you can do like some values cards, exercises, and walk through these exercises that'll help you identify what are the top 5 things that are important to me in my life. Another thing that I like to do is to say, it's what I call the 2010. Well, no, hang on. I don't call it this. Jim Collins calls it the 2010 test. You say, hey, if I woke up tomorrow morning and I had $20 million in my account that came from nowhere, first of all, you should be a little bit skeptical and probably ask, like, where in the world did this come from before you spend it? But let's assume you're good to go. What would you do with that money? How would you spend it? You can't pay off debts and you can't invest it. What would you do with it? And that oftentimes highlights the things that are really important to people. Like, they'll say things like, well, I would take my whole family on a trip to blank. And it extracts that time with family and creating memories are really important. Or they would say, like, well, I would give at least $1 million of it to this cause. And you're like, okay, so it's important to get back. Why that cause? And it starts peeling back these layers of the things that are actually important. Another way that I like to look at it is you go and look at you can do this in your head, you can do it on your phone, but go back and reflect on the last 3 to 6 months and think and ask yourself, what are some of the things I did in the last 3 to 6 months? where I was truly happy, felt fulfilled, was enjoying the moment, and want to do more of. There's another old adage where you're like, hey, if you did that, if that worked so well, if you like that so much, why'd you stop doing it? And it's like, well, because it worked, right? It's the same thing with things we do in life. If you go back and look through your pictures, or you just spend some time, you look at your calendar and the things that you did, you'll be like, man, I really enjoyed that. I want to do more of that moving forward. So the classic example I give is I was scrolling through. No, you know what it was? I was on Facebook. You know how Facebook pops up those memories from the past? Well, there's a memory of when I took one of my sons to lunch right after school one day, which I used to do on a monthly basis. We'd have a special like lunch date, hang out, just one-on-one time. And why did I stop doing it? I have no idea. But I looked at it and I was like, that's something that I want to do more of. That's one way that I want to live more intentionally, is to go and say, hey, like I would like to spend more one-on-one time with my kids. And it didn't come from thinking about the future. It came from sitting and reflecting on what are the things that have created that intent, that have created the meaning in the past, and how can I fill my time doing more of that?
What's your advice to somebody that their main purpose in life up to retirement has been their identification with their work, and now all of a sudden that's gone? Or maybe the first one is maybe you don't completely stop working, right? And that might be the first part of that answer. But what are your thoughts on one day you're a senior vice president of sales in a big corporation and you have all these connections and something to do and you feel a purpose, and the next day you're on the couch?
Great question. And you brought up a really good point right out of the gate, which first of all is maybe instead of just retiring, or instead of just walking away altogether, you do some sort of like tapered version of it, or scaled back version where it's like, okay, test it out a little bit, experiment and see what you think. If you're still working, but you had a little bit more time and mental capacity to devote to other things. That a little sidebar here. I think that's one of the things that with money that nobody does well, but we could stand to do a lot better, are like experiments of sorts. Instead of going all in, just say, hey, I've kind of contemplated this idea of moving to, I was talking to a guy the other day. He was like, we spent this past summer in San Diego. Like out for the whole summer, they were in San Diego. I was like, how did you decide to do that? And he's like, well, we thought we wanted to do it, but we weren't sure. And so the first thing we did was we went and we spent 2 weeks in San Diego. And we were like, that was fun. We want to do that. We could go a little longer. So they did a month in San Diego. And then the next thing you know, they're there for the summer. So it wasn't like they just went all in. They experimented, they tested, they said, is this something that we would actually want to do before we go all in and commit to it? And so anyways, that's a whole nother tangent there, Greg, but that's a great point. It's like, you don't have to, it's not black and white. It's not all or nothing. Why don't you test it out, experiment, see how it goes, see what you think. It could be that, let's say you do this, you're like, hey, I'm going to dial back a little bit, and you have more time and mental energy. And it could be that you're like, wow, this actually feels really good. I'm not retiring. Maybe I'm more part-time. I still feel stimulated, but it feels pretty nice to be able to focus on something else. Or it could be that you're like, wow, I thought that I would enjoy having more time, but I feel so bored and not mentally stimulated and challenged that I need to figure out, I may need to go back and work more. But at least you're getting some clarity one way or the other. Now, if you've got somebody who, because this is a classic example, somebody that's like, I want to retire because I think if I can just do that, then life will be better. And they, like you said, they've lived a majority of their life as a senior VP or an exec, and they've been important. They've been running a business, and they leave and they're like, hang on, I didn't realize how much I enjoyed like being able to tell people what to do and everything that goes along with it. There's no great way to walk that back. I mean, aside from the fact that it's like, okay, if you're there now and you realize it, well, you can also probably go back and re-enter the workforce. So that's an option, right? But I think a key there is, and I'll just, since my dad probably won't listen to this reminds me of my dad, who thinks that he wants to work for the rest of his life. And he's like, I don't know what I do with all the time. I mean, and I'm like, I wrestle with it. I struggle with it because I'm like, I think there's probably an element of that that's true, but I don't fully believe that. And so it's this exercise, and I've kind of talked with him about it, although he's not super open or receptive to hearing it from me. But what I've done with other people in the past too is just like try to identify what are the components, like what are these underlying foundational things that you enjoy about the work that you do, and is there a way to replicate that if you're not working. Right? So like, okay, you don't want to sit around and golf every day. You don't want to sit around and watch TV. You're used to managing people, and you like the relationships that brings and the impact that you get to have on people's families, but also people like, let's say you, as an advisor, right? You're like, I enjoy working with people and the impact I get to have on them. Well, what other ways is there a way that you could still work with people and have an impact, but not be working 80, 90-hour weeks, because that may be costing you time that you could be spending on other things that are important to you. So
it's not the job or the career that you necessarily love. It's what aspects of that are important, and then try to replicate that in healthier ways, maybe in retirement.
I think that's right. Yeah. Ultimately, it's like, it's not the job that you love. It's something that the job provides you. It's something.
I think you said it earlier, Brendan. And what I hear a lot of clients talk about, it's impact. They want to know that they're making an impact somewhere in life on someone or some organization to where they feel like they're making a difference. And, I've had these conversations recently as well, to where people have maybe successfully transitioned into retirement. They're traveling, they're active, they're playing sports and doing other things. However, the honeymoon period of retirement starts to wear off a little bit, that newness of it. And there's something else missing here. Like, and what is it? And it's, I just don't feel like I'm making an impact like I used to. And I miss that. And so helping people figure out, how can you still have purpose and make an impact in the world around you becomes, I think, really important for some that are looking for that. And they find that that's an area in their life that they miss doing, that they maybe did when they were working or ran their business or whatever.
Yes. I think maybe one of the happiest retired people that I know. Now, granted, I don't know a lot of people that are retired, but I know a number of them. One of the happiest retired people that I know is my father-in-law. And I don't think he did this intentionally, right? But we look at him now, we try, and like he's to the point where like we try to get him to like come hang out with our kids or babysit or, help with offload some of the responsibilities of having kids. And he's like, sorry, I would love to, but I've got this tennis match today. I've got this golf match today. But the one thing that he does, I think, because a lot of people do that, but the one thing he's done that in hindsight, as I look back on it now, that I think's helped him the most is, and he doesn't even seem like he's getting older. He seems like he's getting younger. He has this foundation in Kenya that he's in charge of. And he goes over there several times a year, helps them get water systems so they have flowing water, teaches them, educates them, and it like legitimately it lights him up. He enjoys it. He's making a difference. He's having an impact, and he gets like achievement and fulfillment from it, right? Like he's like, I'm doing this cool thing and impacting people at the same time. And I joke with my wife all the time, like, we need to get him to just get rid of that Kenya thing because he's not here often enough to help us with the kids. But in reality, the more we talk about it, the more we're like, we don't want him to give it up, because we think that's like what that continues to drive him and keeps him going and keeps him motivated. And then that pours over into the other areas of his life.
Here's the interesting connection between all the things you've been saying, is that having that sense of fulfillment and impact also, and the social relationships, goes back to helping you with your foundational health, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to be healthier if you're happier, and you're going to be happier. It's kind of they go back and forth.
Yep. Yeah.
If you're sitting on a couch every day miserable, your health is going to suffer.
Yeah. Now it's doubly compounding in the wrong direction.
That's right. Well, Brendan, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and time flies when you're having fun. And so what I'd like to wrap up with is, we've had a great conversation about, having a successful and fulfilling retirement, being intentional, finding purpose. But we're very much like people to take action, because we can listen to these things. But if we don't take action around these areas to help us improve our life, then we're not really making forward progress. So tell us a little bit, as we can wrap up here, is what's the problem with delayed gratification and procrastinating on some of these things?
Yeah, I'm gonna throw one more thing in there as a bow on the conversation we just had. It's a question that I love, and it's actually, I think, well, I don't know if it comes from this person that we both know or if he got it from somewhere, but this is where I heard it from. So it's a guy named Mitch Anthony that I know you guys know and you're aware of.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that's where this question came from. But he asked, I think it's a good question for everybody to ask. He says, think about this. What are the attributes of someone you know that is doing retirement or life, but retirement and life the right way? Like, what are the attributes of doing it the right way? Or even ask yourself, what would it look like if you were someone who is doing retirement the right way? What are the things you would be doing? How would you be spending your time? I think it's a good thought exercise. The current self wants to take what's most important today and prioritize that. You still have to think about your future self. Like, you can't just live for instant gratification. You have to think about your future self, but the future self's not really guaranteed, right? We don't know how long we have. We're not sure how long we're going to be around to do this. So it's like, hey, if I save for retirement, then what happens if, and I'm supposed to be 65 before I access that? What happens if I don't get to that point? Or what happens if something else happens along the way and I can't retire at 65? And the real challenge is like, well, what happens if I'm 75 now when I'm going to retire and I'm not in the same health? So we have this, I think the problem is we tend to lean towards this virtue of delayed gratification. We tend to praise the idea of, oh, I didn't buy this nice thing. I saved as much money as possible so that I could save it for the future. Oh, we didn't take this trip this time, but we saved it and that's going to be worth X in the future. And it's like, well, what if X never comes? Number one, we just shit on that. But the other thing is, you don't know what you're going to be like in 10 years. And like we already said, your health's not getting any better. Your kids are getting older. Like, for example, we think about it and we're like, we have these trips we want to take with our kids. And part of the reason we want to take them now is because they still like hanging out with us and they still like being with us. And we get to create memories with them. And so it's good. We want to make sure we're prioritizing the future. We're not neglecting it. Like to Greg's point earlier, we're planning, we've looked at it. We're making sure that we're doing the things to not neglect the future, but we're also weighing and balancing the present and saying, okay, yeah, but we could have that in the future, but our kids aren't going to want to hang out with us then. So why don't we take this trip now and create memories now while we can? And I think the last thing I would say around this is it's a tough balance to strike. I know that. I mean, we know that much. But there's a guy, the book's right behind me. It's called Your Future Self. And the whole idea of the book is like this: the current self is selfish. We see our future self as nothing more than a stranger. Like studies back this up. That's how we see our future self. That's why it's so hard to act in the future. So the majority of the books are around this idea of here's how you make better decisions for your future self. But the guy who wrote the book, his name's Hal Hershfield, the guy who wrote the book on the future self even stresses, he's like, the future self is important. And I've written a whole book on it, but we can't neglect like the current. We can't just praise the future and neglect the current. We've got to strike the right balance between how do I maximize the life that I want to live today, but also set myself up for the future. And that's why oftentimes I was sitting here thinking about it earlier. I mean, one of the best ways you can do that financially anyways, one of the best ways to do that financially is you have to have, like Greg said earlier, the clarity to know do I have everything set up to where I'm going to be okay in the future so that it frees me up to live in the present. You need to know that you're doing the things you can do to create a future that's successful to then go, okay, I can spend money now in the present as well.
And the importance of taking action on this is because we want to make sure that you have the confidence to live your life today, because a consequence of not taking action could mean that you live a life of regret down the road. And we want to find that right balance. So, Brendan, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope our audience has really benefited a lot from this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, Brendan, how do people get in touch with you if they have some questions?
They can go to the website, rfgadvisory.com. They can find me on there or on LinkedIn. I like to hang out on LinkedIn quite a bit and put some stuff out there. Those are probably the two best ways.
Okay. And Nate, how do we get in touch with you and Greg?
designwealthadvisors.com is the best way to find us, or you can call us at the office 720-833-7676.
And another amazing part of this podcast was finding out that Brendan is a fellow pickleballer, right?
Yes.
There you go.
Yes.
Yeah, that
We
is right.
love it, Brendan.
I made the comment this morning to my wife. I was like, why have I not played pickleball in the last couple of months? I've got to get back to playing it, especially as the weather starts turning. It's a great time to do more indoor pickleball.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. Please like, follow, and share this podcast with your friends. Until next time, I'm Wendy McConnell.